So there's this famous line that I'm sure many of you know, and it gets shifted now again depending on the topic. But that line is, if you build it. Now sometimes people change a little bit of it, he will come, they will come. That's the original. If you build it, he will come. I don't even remember that movie. I just remember baseball and ghosts. I think that was the point of it, but I do not really remember much about it. But there is a famous line that if you build it, he will come. And regardless of how people might switch it up a little bit, the sentiment is the same. This idea that one must simply take a step, simply begin to act, and that this will generate results. And I can't deny the attractiveness of the comment that if you do one big thing, all of the little things will come together. If you work more, if you try harder, if you invest a little bit of more time, all of it will fall into place. But what about when it doesn't? What about when your hard work doesn't generate the creation of something more beautiful, something more organized, something more fruitful? What happens when it simply creates more work, more tiredness, less energy, and less joy? What happens when the notion of if you build it ends with, you will be exhausted? What are we building? Now, if one were to refer to the stories of John Wesley and Mother Teresa, we would find ourselves in the midst of the lives and the stories of historical greats, so-called pillars of the church and role models for Christ followers. Mother Teresa is known for her work in Calcutta among those who were called the Untouchables. And John Wesley is noted as birthing the Methodist movement of which we are a part. And they are both known for shifting how the church saw their role in the world. And what's unique is that each of these stories is that neither one particularly intended to or longed to do the work that they were known for, the work that they became, kind of legends because of. Wesley wanted to bring reform to the Anglican Church, to help smooth out the rough edges of the institution. But along the way, he started an entire new movement. He insisted on structures that invoked more freedom for women, more space for the poor, and communities that engaged together regardless of class and background and education. Unbeknownst to him, unintended, there was a new church, a new way of thinking about the church. Now, Mother Teresa worked among the poorest of the poor, those often overlooked and forgotten. Their stories so bitter and their lives so filled with hardship that she had no choice but to step in. Mother Teresa, despite her devotion, many people may not know this, endured lots of kind of moments of darkness. She would have what you would call like the dark night of the soul, this sense of God being far off despite her deep commitment to the work of the church and the mission of God. It was her early life vow to say yes wherever God was leading, regardless of where God was leading, that seemed to sustain her when she found herself in uncertain and unsure places about her calling and her work. Two different stories in two different generations who sought to do little else than to be followers, little else than to find their way into the footsteps of Jesus. Imperfect as they were, there is something about their stories that makes me wonder, what are we building? This morning we heard Psalm 127, and it begins with that famous, I think it's a well-known phrase, unless the Lord builds, the work of the builders is wasted. This psalm is part of what we call the Psalms of Ascent. There are 15 psalms that are thought to be the songs that were sung on the way to worship. They were the songs sung as people traveled from their various corners and posts and headed towards the temple for seasons of celebration. Some would travel a short distance and others would travel for days with their donkeys, their packs of food and clothing, their children in tow and their eyes set on Jerusalem. When I read these Psalms, it's kind of interesting how clearly they kind of show a progression of movement, outline a picture of travel and a journey. In the early portion of the trip, in Psalms 120 to 121, you kind of get this glimpse of this large, looming, and dangerous set of hills ahead of them. Yet they come to the conclusion that because God is with them, they can continue on their way. And then Psalm 124 announces that if it had not been for the Lord, we would have been devoured. This picture of those who rejoice because they have made it through a difficult part of the journey. And then Psalm 126 reminds the people that when you are between your former good days and are headed towards which you are hoping are better days, that even when it's hard, even when you are moving ahead with tears, that in the end you will reap with joy. And then Psalm 127, nearly halfway to the end of the Psalms of Ascent, we hear this call to endurance, to keep putting one foot in front of the other as we follow the leader, reminding ourselves of who it is that leads the way and who the builder actually is. And so while I wonder, what are we building? The psalmist asks what appears to be a far more important question. He asks, who is the builder? Somehow it's in answering this question that we find our way to better understanding what it is that is being built and what it is that is worth building. In John 15, Jesus sits with his disciples just before he's about to be arrested. And the words documented here are the final words before everything shifts for them and for us. And I wonder often with what kind of urgency or tone that Jesus would present his words. Not just as ones who are about to watch their friend and brother die, but also as ones who are about to witness the resurrection, the manifestation of the Spirit, and the rise of the church. The next several hours, days, and months would have been life-changing and world-altering for the disciples and the crowds that followed alongside. And so when Jesus says, "Remain in me, and I will remain in you, for a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine, then you cannot be fruitful unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who remain in me and I in them will produce much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing." When Jesus says these words, I wonder if the disciples understood the deep gravitas of the words being spoken. And I wonder if you can hear kind of a twinge of the psalmist's words in Jesus's. This reminder that all we have to offer is insufficient when we forget who the builder is, when we find ourselves disconnected from the vine. The disciples have no idea what is ahead of them, and if you follow their story, again and again it becomes apparent that on their own they can do nothing, that they labor in vain. There's Judas, who betrays Jesus and his friends, Peter, who denies ever knowing Jesus, Thomas, who refuses to believe without seeing, and as Jesus ascends, they still wonder if Jesus will form and take over the government. And as the church emerges and multiplies repeatedly, it is the minor differences between the Jewish and the Gentile believers that keeps everyone in their corners moving away from rather than towards the mission of God. But it is equally the reminders to lean into the vine, to remember who the builder is that spurs the church forward. As Jesus reminds Peter that he is loved and wanted despite his actions, the way the Holy Spirit confirms among the most militant of believers that even those they once thought of as unclean can be a part of the church. The ways Paul pushes through ideology and religiosity, and all the ways they tear down the empire in search of the kingdom, the renewal of all things as God intended. These are all the signs of something beautiful, all the signs of those who understand who the builder is. So what is being built, and who is doing the building? These two questions can shift how we live. These two questions can change how we see the world around us. You see, it is one thing if we are the builder. If our default and our ways of being are simply good enough, and if our markers of success are sufficient. But history tells us, and our own stories tell us, that there is something about allowing who we are and who we are created to be, with all of our talents and all of our gifts and all of our ideas and all of our worldviews, that when shaped and formed by Jesus and shaped and formed by his love, that we can move our actions from being centered solely on our careers or our families or our communities or even our greatest ambitions to change the world. All things that are worthwhile. But when these same actions, these same ways of being are connected to the vine, are formed and shaped by the builder, suddenly what we are building is no longer just about self or just about us or just about profit or just about winning or just about gaining or just about becoming. Instead, they become linked to the mission of God. They become conduits through which God's kingdom come and his will is done on earth as it is in heaven. You can say amen. Come on. And so wherever we find ourselves in the midst of rubble, in the midst of building plans and sketches and seeking our way to gain permission to both tear down and build up, whether that be in your work or your family or your community, whether it be institutional or systemic, large or small, impossible or feasible, we are invited to ask the question, what is being built and who is the builder? And if what we are building moves us or others away from the invitation to participate in the renewal of all things, if what we are building moves us away from the message and the work of the kingdom, if what we are building has all of the trappings of religiosity, but in no way looks or sounds like Jesus, then perhaps we have become the builders. Perhaps we have become the ones striving for perfection rather than humbly allowing Christ to be our host, Christ to be our model, Christ to be the builder. And unfortunately, we see it all around us. The ways that churches seek to build apart from Christ. The ways we are far more eager to be shaped by our best rules than by the Jesus revealed to us in the Gospels. The way we choose doctrine over humans, the ways in which we are willing to throw the first stone rather than to extend forgiveness. All of the ways we want to make less space rather than more. But when we come to the conclusion, whether for the first time or the 99th time, that somehow in order to build in the direction of the message of the kingdom, we must be willing to let go of our capacity to build, our capacity to guard, to protect, to go up, to go higher, and to gain more. But instead, with all of our hearts and our minds and our souls, be committed to surrender. Surrender to the one who is both the message and the messenger of the gospel. Gabby and Andrew Wilkes note this in their book, "We cannot build a truly worthwhile life, church, career, ministry, community, solution, or strategy without centering our labor in the Lord. Unless the Lord raises the family, unless the Lord upholds the church, unless the Lord continues to strengthen, the victories lose some of their luster and the losses take on more weight. Let today be a day when you resolve to build and labor alongside our God, in whom all our labor, even our failures, find their place and their purpose." And the beauty that emerges from this is probably the most significant part. When we are no longer the builder, when we no longer sense we must be the vine, when we no longer see ourselves as the end and the means, we are suddenly given permission to rest. We're suddenly given permission to breathe in and to breathe out, to do what it is that the Spirit calls us to and leads us to, knowing that what is before us, that which is being birthed in us, does not solely require us. Instead, we are given permission to rest, permission to move and follow where the Spirit is leading without anxiety and without worry, but with the knowledge that as much as the outcome of the work is a gift from the builder, so is the invitation to rest a gift from the builder. God gives rest to his loved ones. Wilkes says this, God grants rest to her beloved. This is what the psalmist tells us. Take your rest as an act of spiritual resistance within a capitalist culture that idolizes professional achievement and workplace effort. Deep rest, not merely bodily recuperation, but physical, emotional, and spiritual restoration. This is an embodied practice that strengthens our justice imagination. By embracing your rest without guilt or anxiety, you experience divine grace, a foretaste of Sabbath rest in the world to come. Take your rest. You deserve it. So what are we building? And who is the builder? Two questions that I think are perfect for the month of January. What are you building as a family? What are you working together? What are you working towards within your small group or your small communities? Where are you headed in your career? What opportunities are you waiting for? What do you sense is ahead of us as a church? And where are you being asked to invest in your neighborhood or your community? And then as you think about those questions, I hope you can equally wonder and you can equally ask, who is the builder? And if you were the builder, doing all of the things in all of your strength and all of your power and all of your wisdom, what will it take for you to offer the task, to offer the planning, to offer the outcomes to the one who is the author and the finisher of our faith? Ask the worship team to come up. Throughout the ages, people have found this to be a difficult question to answer, and they have found it even more difficult to live out. And so if you could go back and speak to Abraham, it was a monumental task for him to believe that God could deliver on his promise that he would be the father of a great nation. For Moses, it was challenging for him to kind of offer over this idea that he could be a part of freeing people from the bondage of slavery. For Esther, you can imagine that it would have been this overwhelming idea that God could use her to save her people from annihilation. And for David, I'm sure when he was that little boy, last to be called and forgotten, that he probably couldn't imagine that he would one day be a king. And for Huldah, she didn't know how God would use her courage to change the trajectory of a king. For Elizabeth and for Mary, for John the Baptist, for Peter and for Paul, for the early churches, knowing what they were building and who the builder was transformed them and those they encountered. But it required them, sometimes daily, sometimes moment by moment, to choose surrender over control, to choose rest over striving, to trust that when they were fully themselves, fully alive, fully connected to the vine, trusting the builder, they could participate in and become co-creators of the renewal of all things. So we're going to close with a song, and that song announces, "You are the same God." The same God who led the historical and biblical greats, who patiently waited while they erred, while they stumbled, and when they trusted. That is the same God who is present and at work and alive in us, inviting us to be changed as we participate in transformation, as we find strength, as we move through rest, and as we follow the builder. What are you building, and who is the builder? Let's stand together. In John 15, when you come to verse 16, there's this beautiful statement where it says, "You didn't choose me, I chose you. I appointed you to go and produce lasting fruit, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask for using my name. This is my command. Love each other." As you go into this week, I hope that regardless of what you encounter, regardless of where you find yourself building, where you find yourself among things that are broken or things that need repair, that you will understand that you have been chosen. You've been chosen by God to go and to produce. You've been chosen by God to be led by him as the builder. You've been chosen. And so you don't go in there alone. You don't go into these situations by yourself. You don't go in needing to have all of the answers and all of the solutions, but you do go in knowing that you can rely, that you can trust, and that you can find rest in the God who is the great I am. Have a blessed week.